Okay, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody. Welcome to another webinar. My name is Kyle King. I am the Managing Director of Capacity Building International, and we are joined here by Harold Drager and Russell Dippy from Australia. So thanks again for joining us. I've seen a lot of familiar names and faces, and many of you have been with us in the past with our previous webinars. And today we have a special guest with us, okay, and we're going to talk about Australia. And one of the things that's going to be really interesting, I think, is just to hear about all the different dynamics behind Australia and the different aspects that they're having to deal with. We were just talking with Russell before we started about the differences between winter and summer, between where I am, for example, in Germany, and then where Russell is, and it's it's dramatically different, to say the least. But before we get started, I'm going to just go through a few introductory remarks. But first, let's get to our introductions. And of course, as always, joined here today by Harold Drager. Harold, how are you?
I'm fine, thank you.
Good. And Russell, welcome to the webinar.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
And Harold, did you have anything before I get to the administrative remarks?
No, I just wanted to say that very happy to see so many signed up again with us, and also having Russell on to tell about Australia. And I just like to point out that Russell is a Teams member, and he is also TQC certified, as you see of all the credentials he has behind his name. So that is a possibility for everybody. And I also am very happy to tell you that I had a call from Sri Lanka, where one professor wanted his students to attend to our webinar, if that was okay, and certainly it is. So everybody joining us and have other ones to join, please do that. That I would like to say in the opening. Kai, over to you.
Thanks, Harold. Yeah, definitely. This is a great example of where education academia comes together, using these webinars and information sharing to help with their own education programs. I think that's great. So before we get started, of course, we're going to do our normal administrative announcements. If you let us know in the chat, of course, where you're coming from, if Sri Lanka has joined us and we're actually here with the students, that'd be great to know. Just simply drop us a line in chat and let us know. And of course, for the Q&As are always something that we have to manage with every webinar. But of course, we get about, I think, around 30 questions during the webinar presentations. Russell is going to do his best to try and answer them as he does go through his presentation today. But what we will do is we'll have a short Q&A after the presentation is over in case we've missed any. And then we'll try and what I try to do is to roll up these questions. So if they are somewhat thematically the same, I try to ask one bigger question and hopefully address those. And of course, use that in the Q&A fixture, because we also are able to print out a report of the questions that have been asked, as opposed to putting them inside of the chat, which makes it a little bit more difficult to find later on. So use, of course, the chat for comments and things like that. That's completely fine. And looking forward to your questions. Now, one of the things that is really different about this webinar series moving forward is that the webinar series between CBI and Teams is now sponsored by the Institute for Security Governance. And the Institute for Security Governance is really a key, what I think is a key institutional capacity building entity that exists. It's working specifically in this emergency management and resilience field. And so ISG is sponsoring our webinar series, and they've developed a series of concise papers, or what they're calling smart sheets, designed to inform government stakeholders from the US, but also partner institutions, about specific institutional capacity building functional or issue areas. Now, you might be asking yourself, like, why is this relevant and how does this pertain to what we're doing in the emergency management field? But this is where you can look there on the right side. You'll see that there's a new smart sheet that was just released in May, and it's about building resilience for national defense. And ISG is one of the very few organizations that I've seen, at least in the international space, that is working and blending these topics of emergency management, resilience, national defense, and security together. At CBI, we've always been a long proponent of the fact that emergency management is a great tool to increase stability in other nations, especially ones that are less resilient. So increasing emergency management capabilities, leading to greater resilience, and then of course leading to greater national security and defense capabilities. And so I see the ICB role and what ISG is doing in terms of ICB and institutional capacity building is one of the few instances where we're able to see that actually coming into fruition from the US government. If you have any questions about this program specifically, and if you want to know if your own nation is involved or is working with ISG, especially if you're coming from a national disaster management authority or agency, reach out to Mr. Scott Moreland here at the Emergency Management and Resilience Functional Lead and ask him a question, send him an email, or also, of course, Ashley Woodson, who's also over with ISG as well at NPS, the Naval Postgraduate School. Ask them a question and see if they're involved, and if they aren't involved, maybe you want them to have to get involved and build that relationship. And of course, go over to the Institute for Security Governance website, and you can find all the smart sheets over there and see what else they're working on. So happy to have ISG on board as a sponsor of the webinar series as we move forward. Now, speaking of that, we are now a community of over 200, about 268 emergency management professionals that are now in our LinkedIn event series that are all connected. And then we're trying to build out this community of interest, especially with the international models in emergency management. If you haven't done so already, just join us on LinkedIn and follow that, because that's where we're putting the recordings of the webinars, slides when we do have them, and where we will answer questions if you do have any. And again, coming back to the questions issue, if we do happen to miss one of your questions, it's not intentional. It's just that we have so many that we're actually having to filter through and try and get answered. And so I'm sure Russell will be happy to answer any questions that you might have. And if we do miss it, just put it in the LinkedIn group. We'll see it. I'm there every day, and then we'll send it over to Russell as well, so that he can answer accordingly. And go ahead and follow Teams and the International Emergency Management Society and ISG and others on social as well. They're all there, and stay current on the events. So as far as future webinars, as we're moving forward, we now have United Kingdom coming up next after Australia, Bulgaria, Thailand. A new edition of the Pacific Disaster Center will be joining us. And then we have Italy, Germany, and the future of emergency management discussion is something that I think particularly you won't want to miss, because that's going to be a panel discussion with a number of the previous representatives that have been here throughout the webinar series. And we're going to be talking about the challenges facing the emergency management community and what's happening in the future, and what really the future of emergency management now, post-pandemic, and everything else that we've learned. We're also going to go into a smart cities presentation by Teams, and also a data science presentation as well. Are all currently scheduled. And because we are so spread out, because it is the International Emergency Management Society, there are a number of time zones that we are dealing with. So again, not every time zone is going to fit perfectly. If you're in California, it is a very early morning for you. So that's why we record these, and we do post these later on, so that everybody will have the ability to at least view the webinar later on after we've gone through post-production. But just keep that in mind. We're not trying to target just one specific audience. We're just trying to find a best time zone for everybody, and it does fluctuate based on the speaker as well. So that's just the simple administrative remarks I got for this opening. And Russell, now I'll turn it over to you, and looking forward to the presentation.
Thank you. I hope everybody can see the presentation. And straight out Australianism, good day, whether that be good evening, good morning, good afternoon, or any other time zone that we've got there. As was said, my name is Russell Dippy. I'm a doctoral student at Charles Sturt University. I hope to be submitting my final thesis in about 12 months. Allegedly a part-time set of studies, but for anybody that's done it, you'll know that it's not really part-time. And I'm also the Emergency Management Coordinator for South Australia Police here in Australia. So we'll run through the presentation. I have got the questions sitting open on my screen. So if you do have any questions, please don't be afraid to ask as we go through. I'll endeavour to answer them as much as possible. I have included links on the slides, including one that I saw when I was doing it, where it gave me a quick QR code, which I'll explain as we go through some of the resources that are available to everybody in an open format for you to get through. So Australia, Kyle and I were talking beforehand about the difference between winter in Germany and winter in Adelaide. All of winter in Adelaide has a plus sign in front of the number, just as a simple example, whereas Germany and so on seems to have minus signs. I think I prefer my version. So we're just going into winter here at the moment, but we won't get too cold. So slides. This is the mandatory one from the Compare website, throwing Australia across the top of other countries. We've got a cattle station in South Australia called Anna Creek, which is 24,000 square kilometres. The country of Slovenia is 20,000 square kilometres. So as I said, we've got a cattle station in South Australia that's bigger than the country of Slovenia. But we don't have a lot of people. So to break Australia up into the states, the different colours of the different states, I'm from South Australia in the middle bottom. the city of Adelaide. You can probably see down the bottom. I recently drove to Darwin, so basically straight up the middle. That's 3,500 kilometres, and there's not a lot in the middle there. So the Australian arrangements may vary from some of the other countries in relation to the number of agencies that are involved in emergency management and some of the roles that are undertaken. By the same token, we have a number of the same sorts of emergencies, maybe a bit more of a spread. So we can go through from floods to fires, which you've probably all heard about for Australia. We do have some earthquakes. Australia, though, is not on the edge of a plate. We're on a mid-plate. So we don't tend to have the severe earthquakes that you hear of in New Zealand or in areas of the United States. Drought can be a problem for us. It's not normally considered an emergency, but for those that are suffering drought, it is to them. We have had cyclones, we have had exotic animal diseases, and of course, like everyone, we're suffering from the impacts of COVID. But the fact that we're an island means that those impacts are considerably less than some other countries. So if we break it down, Australia is a federation of states. So under the Australian Constitution, the Australian government, the national government, is responsible for limited issues. And most of those issues relate to Australia and its relationship with countries outside of Australia. Things happening within our national border, within the individual states, are the responsibility of the states. Comparing with our American friends, we see a lot of stuff on the news media around the country of the National Guard coming in to help. In Australia, all of defence is an Australian government resource, and the ability to use defence assets is very limited based on our constitution. The states in the first instance are required to do everything they can to address the issue with their own resources. So it does put a lot more emphasis on the states, but it does lead to the states having a lot of mutual aid type arrangements, a lot of commonality of process, a lot of ability to share equipment and resources. But bearing in mind that the next nearest capital city to Adelaide, which is Melbourne, is 800 kilometres away, talking about sharing is something that comes with a time impost. And that always needs to be considered when you're talking about moving resources, people, equipment around Australia. So regardless of all the numbers that are on here, they're just there for your reference. The bold numbers on the right-hand side are what I wanted to highlight. If we look at our full-time paid firefighting resources across the country, we've got nearly 22,500 firefighters. We've got 201,000 volunteer firefighters. Our state emergency services, which are about storm and weather-related sort of emergencies, paid and volunteer, there's 25,500, and total police, both uniform and non-uniform, or sworn and unsworn, there's 140,000. Sounds a lot in total, but when you consider that Australia is 7.5 million square kilometres, that number of resources doesn't actually spread too far. It does give us lots of space where there's nothing. There's limited community, there's limited populations, but there's also limited resource if something were to happen. So lots of numbers, but purely there, pick on the other ones, and if you want the other numbers for your own breakdowns, it's there for you. So as I said, we are a federation bound by the Australian Constitution. The Constitution has what they call a division of powers in it. Australian government external, states and territories internal. The Australian government, though, doesn't leave us to our own devices. It will come and help if it can help and if we have exhausted our resources. By the same token, though, the equipment, resources, and capabilities that the Australian government has are very much fit for the purpose for which they have them. So, for example, recently during bushfires, we were looking for some bulldozers. Our friends at the Department of Defence said, we've got one of them. It's a bulldozer attached to an Abrams battle tank. Will that do what you want? Nothing personal, something like a 25-foot battle tank bulldozer blade is probably just a little bit of overkill, for want of a better word. Rick's asked, do individual cities and municipalities maintain their own police? No. One state, one police force. We do not have multiple police forces. I know on one set of numbers I heard that there were more police forces in the United States than there are actually police officers in Australia. So my state, South Australia, we're 5,000 and a bit police, but that's it, one agency. The Australian government has a policing agency which has special agents type stuff. They have jurisdiction for some issues across the state, but their focus is very much on the transnational organised crime, those sorts of cyber-related issues. So I hope that answers your question, Rick. Over recent times, we've done a large number of reviews. Those reviews vary. There's the mandatory internal review or debrief. There are independent reviews. Australia, having come out of the English system, has the role of the coroner, whose job it is as a judicial officer to investigate deaths where the cause is unknown. It's an independent review process that operates as part of the legal system, and they will do reviews. And as police agencies, we are very much subject to review by the coroner. We have state-based royal commissions. So again, based on our English background, it's a legislative review with powers to actually go through and ask questions. And we have national ones. Now, I'll put a couple of examples in there because they have put a lot of emphasis and a lot of change on how we are dealing with some emergencies and some concepts, and even now down to COVID as a result. And I'll give you an example of the state-based Royal Commission. So in 2009, there was the Black Saturday fires in Victoria. That's the state immediately to the east of South Australia. And in that fire, 179 people perished. The state of Victoria set up a Royal Commission. And one of the findings there, which came out in its report in 2010, and you can search it yourself on the internet and download the 4 volumes of the final report and the volume of the interim report. But one of the findings there was about telling people about the emergency more so than doing something about it. So not being demeaning of our firefighters. Firefighters, it has been said, put wet stuff on red stuff to make black stuff. In the past, we have spent a lot of effort throwing an awful lot of water at fires in the hope that we will save people's lives. The Victorian Royal Commission came back and reminded us that if we actually told them not to be there, if we actually addressed that issue of public information and put as much effort into that, we wouldn't have to worry about as many people perishing in what we've done. If we bring that forward 10 years to COVID in South Australia, when we started the COVID response, our state health department thought that 2 tweets a day was enough public information about dealing with COVID. And we had to spend a lot of time educating them on what had been learnt from previous events, in that we had to spend more, as much effort telling people about COVID and its effects and what they need to do, as what we needed to do with actually fighting the COVID example. The National-based Royal Commission, and I've given you the example of the one that was done last year, 2019-20, over that summer period, we had a large number of major fires across large areas of Australia. That was a national Royal Commission that was run that examined issues and looked at whether or not we could make common recommendations that applied in all states. So for my work role at the moment, we're doing a lot of work in trying to make sure that although we are individual states and have the ability to do things by ourselves, that we actually do continue that commonality where at all possible. On the bottom there, I've put a reference for the Bushfire and Natural Hazards Cooperative Research Centre, which is a national academic body. All of the states contribute to it. And there are a number of reports there that anybody that's listening tonight or today can look at, including one there by Cole, Dovers and Eburn, where they've actually gone through and listed all of the reviews they could find going back over 20 odd years and doing a review of all the recommendations. So it becomes very much a lessons repository of lessons that we have identified. Whether or not we've learnt from them is another story, but at least lessons and recommendations. And again, everyone that's listening can have a look at that material, download it and see if there's anything common or similar that you may wish to use. Very busy slide. I think the key thing is I managed to put a little QR code down in the bottom. All of the documents and so on that I'm referring to in this slide are actually available from the Australian Institute for Disaster Resilience, which is where that QR code will take you. All of those handbooks are there. So if we go back to the underlying principles of emergency management in Australia, funnily enough, most people here will recognise them. Comprehensive: prevention, preparedness, response and recovery. We don't do the slight variation that the US does with mitigation at the beginning. We do prevent and prepare. We again look at all hazards. For my state, we have one state emergency management plan, and we apply that plan to fire, flood, pestilence, or any of the other types of emergencies. But the one which almost fell by the wayside for a while until the Victorian Royal Commission came up was actually the prepared community. It had existed for a while. People understood it, they said it, they didn't necessarily do it. So we've done a lot of work in trying to build the communities up to go to work with us or us to work with them in relation to it. So we have some documents and frameworks that are Australian government led. And although they're Australian government led, that really just means that they're the ones that have conducted the workshops, brought the states together and published the final report. So there's the National Strategy for Disaster Risk Reduction, which came out before the international decades of the different disaster risk reductions. There's the Australian Disaster Preparedness Framework that's in there, which again is about trying to work out how we can get stuff working together to prevent, and prepare. There's an Australian Government Crisis Management Framework, which is again how the Australian Government will actually do stuff, and then their plan. Now, again, all of those documents are searchable on the internet. Then we have a range of what they call handbooks. The Australian Institute for Disaster Resilience is a government-funded body, but managed by a consortium of the Australian Red Cross, the Australian Fire and Emergency Services Authorities Council, AFAC down the bottom, Red Cross, AFAC, and another body in there. but they work together with everybody to produce these frameworks, handbooks, and doctrine documents which everybody applies. So one of them is the glossary. We work very hard that when we talk about prevent, prepare, respond, and recover, we all actually use the same understanding of the words. We're talking about risk, we're using the same understanding of the words across the country. We have a lessons management handbook, which uses the OILS philosophy: observations, insights, lessons identified, lessons learned. We have a generic incident management handbook. And funnily enough, our incident management is almost the same as the American NIMS. It is a management by objectives, a span of control, a pretty standard incident management system. There are some nuances between how the firefighters use it and how the police use it, but those nuances are now, through some work that we've been doing nationally, minor. They are not major variations. So we can have a firefighter from Victoria work just as well in a police incident management system in Western Australia, the other side of the country, because we do have that commonality of system. The other one which I'll highlight there is the Australian Journal of Emergency Management, published by AIDA. It is a free subscription journal which you can subscribe to from that website. It has academic peer-reviewed papers as well as general papers. And if people are wishing to subscribe, as I said, it's free. You can subscribe from the website. They come out 4 times a year. And it is just a source of information that isn't necessarily hidden behind some of the paywall issues that we have with some of the journal processes for those that are outside of academia. We have 2 major government committees that work across the country. The first one is the Counter-Terrorism Committee, and that incorporates New Zealand. New Zealand is a different country. We keep saying that, but then we work together. You will have heard of the ANZUS traditions in the war, Australia and New Zealand. As much as we may pay out and pick on our neighbours, when anything happens, we all work together with our New Zealand neighbours. And even back to our counter-terrorism arrangements are actually consistent. We also have an Australian-New Zealand Emergency Management Committee, again as a peak body. Again, we keep New Zealand there as a member. They don't necessarily have the need to, or they don't contribute financially to the works of the committee like other committee members do, but they do contribute to the intellectual processes of the committee. And from our state, I know we sent resources, policing resources and firefighting or urban search and rescue resources to Christchurch when they had the earthquake. And that was built on the fact that we already had the relationships, we already had the understanding, we were running similar systems and were able to do it. There are also some joint forums, which I've put down the bottom. So AFAC, which got its acronym before it expanded its name. So initially it was the fire agencies across the country. And then it expanded to include the emergency service and the land management agencies across the country. Now, whilst as I said to Rick, that we've only got 1 police service in each state, we do tend to have a few more variations around fire services. So in Australia, we will often have a paid metropolitan-based career firefighting service that deal with structure fires. And we will have a predominantly volunteer-based, but with career staff support, fire service that deals with what we call bushfires, some may call wildfires or scrub fires. We have land management agencies that may have some of their own firefighting resources. In some states, that leads to there being 3 streams of fire service, paid, volunteer and land management. In South Australia, what we've done is the land management fire brigades are actually part of the bushfire brigades as part of the structure, and they work as one. even though some are sourced from different sources. The other independent joint forum that sits there is what they call ANZUS, Australia New Zealand Policing Advisory Agency. And again, that's all of the police services. So whereas AFAC has got 30 or 40 member agencies, ANZUS is simple, it's got 8. The 7 Australian, or 9, sorry, the 7 Australian, the 1 national and the New Zealand representatives on there. And that's about trying to make sure that we have consistency in policing practices, systems, resources, training, etc. So for one of my roles, I've been sitting on the working group that's making sure that the emergency management roles undertaken by police have consistent training sitting behind them across the country. So as I said, that's a QR code there which gets you to a web page to actually download most of those documents, or sign up to the Australian Journal of Emergency Management if you wish. So as I've already said about warnings, it's probably taken us a little bit too long to get our heads around warnings. Our warning system's very much developed from our predominant risk, which has been bushfire. But what we've done over the years is we've applied the same system to all hazards. So we don't have a warning system for fires and a warning system for floods. We have the one system now. That system is currently undergoing a major amount of review. There is a very substantial amount of public consultation and research that's gone into the soon to be released update to our warnings systems. A lot of that came from that Victorian Bushfire Royal Commission in 2009 that showed that we had some gaps in our systems. But we will apply that warning philosophy, that structure, the wording and the way that messages are laid out to all hazards, whether it be fire, flood, pestilence, extreme heat. If we were to look at the hazards, for long enough we used to say that bushfire was our biggest hazard in the country. But what we did do is we had a industrial actuary go through and have a look at the costs in total. And one of the things that we hadn't done was we hadn't put a dollar value on people. And what we found was a lot more people died from heat or heat-related illness in Australia than died from bushfire. And when we actually put that dollar value on people, it actually moved heat-related emergencies up to the second greatest risk to the country from a dollar value. So we'd been dealing with emergencies based on a assumption of the effects which hadn't been complete, because we hadn't actually put a value on one of the biggest parts of the risk, which was the people side of it. So I suppose that's a learning there in relation to our warnings and how we do it. We now spend a lot more time in relation to warnings, and going back to heat, we know that heat illness manifests for some days after the heat wave has passed. So something to be considered in mind. We have, as a result of 2009, the emergency alert push messaging system. That is a messaging system developed or delivered via the mobile telephone companies. It's delivered in 2 ways. It's delivered as a text to voice message, which the system reads out to people based on landlines. I'm sure we're no different to a lot of other countries. The number of landlines around Australia are dropping as the number of mobile phones increases. So that part of emergency alert is becoming less common. But the other part of what emergency alert does is it delivers a message to any phone that is registered against a cell tower within the map polygon that we draw. So if we get a map and say the emergency is here and draw a circle, the system will then determine how many cell towers service that circle. It will then determine what phones from what carriers are affiliated to all of those cell towers, and then deliver the message to everyone that's in there. What that does lead to is a little bit of bleed in that the message goes outside of the circle, because a cell tower might be sitting outside and crossing over, some in, some out. But it does mean that we get the message out very quickly. So in relation to who, there's a question being asked, who has the right to warn? We have a concept of, it's used pretty consistently around the country, of the control agency. The control agency is known in advance for a whole heap of emergency types, and it's up to the control agency to make sure that the message goes out as part of their responsibilities. But the other thing we have is the coordinating agency, and that tends to be where a lot of the police agencies come in. They're sitting there as the umpire, the independent reviewer. They tend to have a lot more resources in a lot broader spread than some of the other agencies. They also have the ability to issue the messages, but what they mostly do is they actually sit there as the reviewer to make sure that the appropriate messaging is going out, so that the control agency in the heat of battle doesn't get caught up in responding and forgetting that learning from the very first dot point on that slide. Telling people about it is as important as doing something about it. So as far as levels, and again, looking at Nahat's question, the district emergency operations centres have the right. It's not done at the centre level, it's done at the agency level. So some agencies will have their local command structures and their local incident management teams issuing the messaging. Some agencies will leave that as a state function, as a way of supporting, but also taking away some of the load on the incident management teams forward. So we know that with the spread of the country, it's quite possible that the incident management teams are operating in areas that don't have the best of information technology support. They don't have the best of Wi-Fi or mobile phone connectivity. And getting that messaging out is a technical requirement that does need a fair amount of infrastructure. So often the message may be identified as being needed by the local incident management team forward, but it will be done back at the headquarters, and they will have people that will liaise direct and push the message out from that end. As far as levels of management within the states, some states have 3 levels. So Queensland, in the top right corner of the country, have a very local government focused response paradigm. So they will have local government, district and state responses. In my state, South Australia, the middle bottom, we have 2 layers. We have a regional response paradigm and a state response paradigm. We don't go down to that 3rd level. So for us, it keeps it fairly streamlined. It reduces the requirement for staff and resources, and just, we feel, makes it smoother for what we're trying to achieve. Training in Australia is varied. So as I've indicated, all of the people pretty well that are involved in managing emergencies have grown up in emergency response agencies. I'm a policeman by trade, but for those of you that saw all the letters after my name, you'll see that I'm also been a St John volunteer, St John being a international organisation that does first aid across the place. A lot of other people who are managing emergencies, have come up through the respective fire, state emergency service or police agencies and have taken on that management role. They haven't necessarily come out of school or other areas of industry and decided, I'm going to take on the career of emergency management. And by emergency management, if we look at the IAM and the general understanding of emergency management, that's about something that deals with prevention, preparedness, response, and recovery. In Australia, almost all of the people that are in emergency management have got a background in response. They've done response, they've been responders, they've grown up as response, and they're trying to expand during their career back into a broader emergency management role. In Australia, we have 3 levels of education, for want of a better way of describing it. We have our normal primary and high school, so the 5 to 18-year-olds. We have our vocational education streams, which are the pre-university. I think in the US they call it similar to college, where they get certificate level what they call vocational training. So it's very much focused at skills and undertaking skills and tasks. And vocational training tends to be, and vocational qualifications tends to underpin those that are working at small to medium level incident controller type levels. So their skills, their training and so on will all be vocationally based. Where we have a little bit of advantage is vocational training in Australia is coordinated nationally. The units of competency, as they call them here, are managed centrally. And I have just sat on a national committee last year where we reviewed the national emergency management units of competency so that we have consistent units and consistent qualifications for those levels of people. Then we get into universities. And although a university as an organisation is accredited, the resources and the delivery of university subjects and degrees, etc., is very much up to the university. So the university, all the universities in some ways are competing for students, they're competing for research dollars, they have that level of competition. We don't have consistent university training in relation to 3 universities will deliver the one product. We'll have 3 universities deliver a degree qualification that uses the words emergency management somewhere in the title, but what they deliver and the focus upon which they apply to their education is different. So some of them may be sociology based, some of them may be science and engineering based. They'll still talk about emergency management as the title of the degree. The university level of education is not common across Australian emergency management. In my agency, for example, I'm the only one with a master's in emergency management from a university. I'm the only one that's ever started a doctoral program within a university in my agency. In fact, there's only one other doctoral student across emergency services that I know of at the moment in South Australia, and they've had to take a sabbatical from work to try and keep up with their studies. So there's been a question asked here in relation to the Bureau of Meteorology. The Bureau of Met is a national capability that's administered by the Australian government. I think it sits under one of the science departments, not Home Affairs. And they provide services and resources to all states, all agencies. we go back to our education and training, there's a vocational training package there that some people do on how to understand extreme weather. The Bureau of Met, as an Australian government agency, will support the vocational delivery of that to the lower level unit managers, etc., and the incident controllers around the country, but they operate very much independently. So the Bureau national resource provides a service to everybody. So education and training can be fragmented. Not everybody is required to do vocational training. If you're delivering vocational training in Australia, you've got to meet a whole heap of registration requirements and standards. They call them registered training organisations. For example, my police agency does not do a vet level of accreditation for new police officers or a university level of accreditation. It delivers an in-house set of training qualifications to everybody, and then allows people to develop and get vocational qualifications as part of their promotional processes later on. The other one which I just want to mention, and I'll shamelessly plug this article. It's one that I had that I prepared during my studies, and that's about certification in Australia. Certification in Australia, from an emergency management point of view, has not been well adopted. There are 4 systems operating in reality in Australia. The EMPS system, which is developed by that AFAC body that I spoke about before, the fire agencies body, and that is about certification of individuals to undertake set roles, and in particular they're looking at certifying incident controllers at what they call a level 3 incident, so the biggest level incidents, trying to certify those that are undertake the incident control, or currently also doing public information and operations, I think, at level 3 incidents. The Emergency Management Accreditation Program, from what I can understand, appears to operate extensively across the US. There have been some attempts for programs to be accredited in Australia, but it hasn't really taken off. CEM, AEM, at the moment, I think there are only 12 CEMs or an AEM in Australia, certified by the International Association of Emergency Management, of which I am one. And TQC, which is the new one that Teams has been working on. There are currently 2 people in Australia, unless we've had a third one, Harold, I'll stand corrected. There are, I think, 2 people in Australia that are TQC certified, and again, I am one. I think there are only 2 people in the world that have got both CEM and TQC, myself and a gentleman from the US. But if we look at TQC, we've got 2 in Australia, we've got 12 CEMs, AEMs. I don't know of any EMAP accredited programs in Australia, and EMPS, there's probably a couple of hundred, but not at emergency management level, but at incident management level. So certification hasn't really taken off in Australia. It would be good if it did. But if we go to CEM or TQC as an example, part of their requirements is very much about understanding that broader emergency management picture. As I explained, most of the people that are doing it in Australia have grown up as response people. They haven't necessarily broadened out into that broad level of prevent, prepare, which is a lot of policy and planning, or the recovery type roles at the moment. So if we look at my agency, the South Australian Police Force, we've got 5,000 people. As far as incident management people, all 5,000 of those uniformed police officers can deal with incidents. That's their bread and butter, what they do every day of the week. As far as emergency management people about them that have that broader role, we're probably down to 15 or 20. And at the higher level emergency management practitioners in our agency, there are 4. There is the Commissioner of Police, the Deputy Commissioner of Police, my Assistant Commissioner and myself. Vinod, you response capacities in relation to SIDS. I'm not too sure what you mean by SIDS, so I'll come back to that one. In relation to preparedness and response for extreme events, climate change and COVID, Australia, as part of its doctrine, always considered that it was doing all hazards. So it tried to write plans and processes that would do everything, even though we always seemed to focus on bushfire primary, flood secondary, and everything else a long way down the list. But what we proved during COVID in my state, for example, in the early days, our health people were really good at being health people. They weren't necessarily really good at being broader multi-agency managers of emergencies at that high level, complex, whole of community with a large requirement for public information and messaging. What we were able to do though, and thankfully for us, our fire season had just about finished when COVID started. We had within our fire agencies 4 high-level pre-formed incident management teams. And we were able to move one of those fire-based incident management teams into the health building. And they were able to talk about incident control, safety, planning, operations, logistics, intelligence, investigation, public information, and recovery as functions within an incident management structure. And they were able to quickly bring the health people who were very focused on the clinical response to the health incident along for the purpose of being able to manage that broader emergency management, that broader multi-agency complex issue. They were able to develop those skills, and over a period of time, that incident management team actually stepped out and health took over and developed those skills. Climate change, as a country, we have recognised. I would say we are not alone in that we have not done as much as what we could in relation to the emergency management side of climate change. We are recognising a lot more of the effects of climate change, whether that be more storms, more floods, more fires. But whether or not we've done enough to prevent and prepare is something that's probably a very political set of statements. I think some aspects of the community say we haven't done enough. Some aspects are saying we're doing too much and it's costing too much. It is probably a common argument across the world about what we're doing. Incident management and emergency management. If we look at our standard incident management systems, we will have somebody in charge of doing something, an incident controller, that will come from an agency that has the specialist skills to deal with it. And they will deal with the response. They will put the wet stuff on the red stuff. They will patch up the injured persons. They will work on dealing with the sick or injured. Very incident focused. Turn up, do something, leave, go back to normal business. So incident management could be a little incident. It could be a 2-car accident at the next intersection. Or it could be a bushfire that is burning through hundreds of thousands of hectares of land, taking out thousands of houses and businesses, etc. So if we have a look at those incidents, we have people that are very good at incident management. We have people that are good at little incidents, we have people that are good at medium-sized incidents, and we have a smaller number that are good at managing big incidents. They're very much incident managers. Emergency managers, though, and I consider myself to be an emergency manager, are very good at the prevention and preparedness activities. They're very good at the policy development. They're very good at the training type stuff. They're very good at working in the whole of government recovery issues and have a role maybe in response. So I'll use myself as an example. In my agency, I do all of the review and update with my team for all of the agency's plans on how we're going to deal with incidents. I'll help to write the training packages. I will educate the managers across the agency as to what their roles are. When it all happens, I won't necessarily be leading it. Those people that are incident managers that are very good at leading in the heat of battle will do that. I may sit in the background and provide them a whole heap of advice and support. I will then go on and deal with the post-event inquiries, the learnings that come out of it, the changes to policy and training. They will go back to normal business. So the police superintendent, for example, will go back to dealing with crime or disorder, domestic violence, break-ins on houses, all their normal business, because they've done incident management, whereas my role has been the emergency management. So I hope that's answered that one. There was a question there in relation to TQC. TQC is a system that the International Emergency Management Society has introduced as an emergency management certification program. Information on it is on the team's website on how to do it. It's a similar sort of system and scenario as CEM from the US, but whereas CEM in the US focuses very much on US focused standards and documentation, and then some processes around certification. And for example, very focused on NFPA 1600. In the TQC model, the standards and documentation is very much around the European side of the world and what some of the underpinning standards and certification and documentation and standards are there. I don't think that they compete. I think they complement. I'm in Australia. We've got the US on one side and Europe on the other. I've deliberately undertaken both to give myself a broader understanding of both sides of the house. So I hope that answers your question about TQC. So I'm pretty sure that's an overview. Happy to take questions, whether they be verbally or we stick with them online with people typing them. Kyle, I'll leave it to you as to how you best want to go through with the information sharing and question part of our session.
Sure, great. Thanks a lot, Russell. So we've had a couple of questions, and we'll just start with this one. It came out, it says, do you use different emergency management models within different emergency services? If so, are they built on the same principles, or is other measures done to ensure operational and tactical cooperation? So are all the models the same across the board with all the agencies at state level and national level?
So there are two incident management systems in use across Australia. We shamelessly plagiarise them from the American NIM system. They are both built exactly on the same system that we plagiarised them from. We have the police version and the fire version. When you put the two org charts side by side, the only difference is the police version is a little bit more focused on multi-layer type incidents where you have a local, regional and state type involvement. And it includes recovery as a key aspect, whereas the fire service one is focused very much on the incident level and not what happens above the incident. but all of the underpinning principles are the same. Management by objectives, span of control, all those things that people that have got any sort of system that's remotely linked to the American NIMS system will understand. And we've nearly got them almost exactly the same, and that's part of my work nationally. Is I'm on both steering groups. My aim is to cut myself out of one committee if I can get them both working together, nearly but not quite.
Okay. All right. So a couple of questions, because I was thinking as you were giving your presentation. The first one being, you had mentioned that you were offered support during the bushfires for basically what military assets, right?
Yep.
What is that coordination mechanism? So again, you had mentioned there's these state level authorities, and if I understand you correctly, that is essentially what we might consider in the States like the lowest local level. Is that correct? And if that's the case, like what is the mechanism that you are requesting or a state is requesting for additional, let's say, interagency resources such as the military?
So to try and put it from what I understand of the US, and I may be slightly wrong, the state here is a state there. We don't have all of the counties, districts, local governments. We have them as local governments. We don't have them as owners of response and recovery organisations. They deal with rates, roads and rubbish, to put it into the Australian vernacular. They don't deal with, they may have some parking inspectors. Everybody seems to hate parking inspectors, but they don't have police. They don't have their own fire. They don't have their own emergency services. They don't have their own ambulance. All of those resources are provided and managed at state level only. Defence assets are owned, managed and provided from the Australian government. The Australian government may have some of those assets in each of the states as part of our defence posture. But if we want to use them, we need to formally request them from the Australian government. We don't have a big thing about guns in Australia. We've got rid of them. If we want to use Australian defence assets, soldiers, to come and help, and they're not carrying guns, it's a little bit easier. If we want them to come out and be carrying guns and be a force as such, we've got so many steps and loopholes and processes to go through, because it is very much against the Australian way to be using force and to be bringing a whole heap of firearms onto the streets amongst the public. Seems to be vastly different to some of the other countries. Well, we quite like it. Although I don't mind going and doing a bit of shooting, it's not something that is as common as in other countries around the world.
Sure. Yeah. So the military support to civil authorities that we would be talking about, that's done at a national level, but based off a state level request. Yep. What was the acronym you were using, or the colloquialism for local authorities? You said it. Rates,
rubbish and roads.
Rates, rubbish, and so local authorities establish rates on what now?
So they will put a land valuation cost against a homeowner. So I will pay the rates to my local council, and they will maintain my local streets. They will trim my local trees. They will take my rubbish bin out. They will collect any stray dogs and cats and that sort of stuff, and hopefully not annoy me too much more than that.
Okay, interesting. So when we talk about, because you also mentioned that the Australian model is, was it protect, prepare, respond, recover? Is that correct?
Prevent, prepare, respond, and recover. PPRR.
Okay. Prevent, prepare. Okay. Where does mitigation fit into that?
So we will sometimes use mitigation instead of the two Ps, prevent and prepare. Depending on where you look at it, some people use them independently. We find that PPRR allows us to break it down a little bit better, because I struggle to understand how you can start mitigating for a disaster when you've already had it. That seems to me very much to be dealing with the closing the gate after the horse has bolted. So if we prevent and prepare, I would suggest that's probably better than waiting until afterwards and mitigating for the next one. Not to say that we don't learn from what we've done in the past, So we very much think about that prevent, prepare. We very much think about making sure that whatever we develop now is able to be used for multiple things. So we have a disaster victim identification capability, but we will use DVI for a terrorist incident. We will use DVI for a multi-car crash. We will use DVI for a plane crash. We will use DVI for a bushfire. It's still the same skill set, but used across multiple environments.
We're running a little bit long, but I just wanted to maybe ask another question, if I could, really quick, Russell, which is about the disaster risk reduction platforms. And so you had mentioned DRR. And what does that, again, kind of fit into this construct? I've seen, because the reason I ask is because we've seen in various different nations, there's different, let's say, levels of integration, I guess I would say that, of disaster risk reduction platforms and different points of view with different national models. What is your take on DRR and Sendai framework and everything else that goes along with that into, currently what you're working on and what you're doing?
So DRR and the Sendai framework, the Australian government is a signatory to all of that. But as we've got that separation, the Australian government deals with what's happening outside of our borders. The states deal with what's inside. We've got the feds that have gone and signed an agreement and they expect us to do some work, but not necessarily giving us some money to do it. So there is a little bit of disparity between what they're signing us up for versus what we're actually able and resourced to do. That doesn't mean we're not trying to do it. We do it using prevent, prepare. We do it with what funding we've got. I think we're probably not alone in that response always seems to get the money. Recovery gets it found after the event because they tend to be able to get money from elsewhere. Governments reallocate it. We would really like to actually prevent and prepare, actually not have it happen, do ourselves out of a job. We haven't yet got there. Would be a nice place to be. So we are using those international frameworks to try and support what we're doing within the environment in which we work. So yes, we're aware of them. Yes, we report against them as a country. We don't necessarily have them fully understood from the incident managers in the agencies. So most of my fellow police officers in Australia wouldn't know anything about Sendai, but those that are doing emergency management would know how we're doing stuff which actually addresses some of the Sendai aims and objectives.
Okay, great. Very interesting. Thanks for that. Harold, do you have anything to say about that?
No, I think this has been great. Good overview and many questions. I think this was good.
All right. Yeah. Russell, thanks a lot. Thanks for your time. Thanks for staying up late to try and get out some information there, especially coming from Australia. Again, everybody, thanks a lot for joining us on this webinar session. We'll go and close it out now. We went a little bit longer than expected, but still, I think it was worth it to get some different perspectives. And again, join us next time as we're moving forward. And Russell, we'd love to have you back and represent Australia in some other panels and discussions in the future.
Happy to at any time. My contact details are on the slide. If people have got any questions, or as you said, Kyle, I'll deal with them through the LinkedIn group as well.
Yeah, definitely. If anybody has any questions, please feel free to reach out to Russell directly, or you can use the LinkedIn group as you see fit. All right. Thanks a lot, everybody. Have a great day and have a great weekend.